Good evening. I'm Ulysses Wilcox, Alumni Ambassador Manager, Office of Alumni Engagement, Walden University. Thank you for joining us this evening for our Talks for Good. We started our Talks for Good series with a historical perspective on equity in education that examines structural racism in our society and underlying issues of equity in our schools. Walden University continues the talk series with a panel discussion that fosters positive discourse and exchange of points of view on how K-12 schools can advance a racially and ethnically diverse education and teacher workforce. How schools frame our nation's history and history makers with inclusive narratives, perspectives, and role models affect how educators teach, how students learn, and how both navigate social issues that deeply impact them and the world they live in. This evening, our 90-minute panel discussion will focus on the challenges and benefits in advancing a racially and ethically diverse K-12 and teacher workforce. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Walden University President, Dr. Ward Ulmer.
Good evening. I'm Ward Ulmer, President of Walden University, and I'm delighted to be with you all this evening. In celebration of Walden's 50th anniversary, we're connecting communities with fact-based information, important resources, subject matter experts, and the opportunity to share experiences in a safe environment. As a leader and as a pioneer in higher education, Walden University has long since been committed to using education to advance positive social change in ourselves, in our workplaces, and in our communities. Tonight, we continue our series of panel discussions titled Talks for Good. Ensuring all students receive a quality education that fulfills their potential is a very important topic that affects all of us, but it especially affects our educators, school service providers, and our policymakers. The COVID-19 pandemic and racial justice movements have escalated awareness of racial and ethnic inequities in education, particularly on students and teachers in K-12 schools across our nation. Tonight, you'll have the opportunity to engage with our esteemed panelists in many ways. They will be sharing their perspectives on how K-12 schools can advance a racially and ethnically diverse education and teacher workforce. This will include how schools frame our nation's history and our history makers with inclusive narratives, perspectives, and role models. Now, we all know this affects how educators teach, how students learn, and how both navigate the social issues that deeply impact all of us. I hope tonight that you'll gain a new perspective and feel equipped to take action. The ideas shared and the conversations you'll have tonight will hopefully only be the beginning of your ability to affect change in your schools and in your communities. And now, I'm excited to introduce someone who will be serving in what has become one of the most difficult roles in America today, a moderator. Dr. Tina Marshall Bradley has more than 25 years experience in higher education, including serving as a faculty member, an administrator, and as a researcher. Her areas of expertise include integrative learning, performance assessment, comparative education, technology and innovation, and enterprise resource planning. She's currently a faculty member at Walden University, where she leads the Curriculum Instruction and Assessment Specialization. Dr. Marshall Bradley earned her doctorate from Iowa State University and her bachelor's degree from the College of Charleston. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Tina Marshall Bradley.
Thank you, Dr. Ulmer, for that gracious introduction and for your leadership at Walden University. Good evening, everyone. It is my great pleasure to first introduce the panelists for this evening. Our first panelist is Rey Saldaña. He is the president and CEO of Communities in Schools, a national organization that ensures all students are empowered to stay in school and on a path to a brighter future. Saldaña is a CIS alumnus whose journey from former student supported by CIS to national leader of Communities in Schools sends an inspiring message to young people nationwide about the power they have to write their own success story. Previously, Saldaña served as the Regional Advocacy Director for the Raise Your Hand Texas Foundation, Chair of San Antonia's VIA Metropolitan Transit, and Chief Engagement Officer with KIPP, San Antonio Public Schools. Saldaña also served 4 terms on the San Antonio City Council, where he was first elected at age 24, becoming the youngest councilperson in the city's history. Welcome, Mr. Saldaña. Our next panelist is Dr. Sonja Santelises. She is the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools and has spent close to 30 years focused on building high-quality teaching and learning to help students excel. Previously, Dr. Santelisis served as Assistant Superintendent for Boston Public Schools and Vice President for K-12 Policy and Practice at the Education Trust, a nonprofit focused on closing the achievement gap experienced disproportionately by Black, Latino, and Native students and those from low-income families. Dr. Santelisis began her career in education as Director of Professional Development and Teacher Placement with Teach for America, New York, and then served as Teacher and Curriculum Specialist at Decatur Clearpool School in Brooklyn, where she oversaw the founding of the middle school. Dr. Santelisis, welcome. And we'd like to welcome our third panelist back home. Tanya Batchelor-Judge is a Walden MS in Education graduate who serves as the district administrator for the school district of Manatee County near Tampa, Florida. As a teacher with 16 years of experience and mother to a young adult son, Batchelor-Judge understands the importance of representation within the classroom and is committed to helping as many students as possible succeed, particularly Black and Brown students. Walden previously supported her mission of increasing representation among educators by providing resources and funds to the Urban Teaching Academy at Howard W. Blake High School. Ms. Batchelor-Judge, welcome home. Before we get started, I would like to review the 4 agreements of courageous conversations as a way of helping to frame the discussions that we will be having this evening. The first agreement we would like for you to consider is that you stay engaged. In other words, we want you to remain emotionally, intellectually, socially, and morally involved as we discuss these topics. The second agreement is to experience discomfort, embrace some ideas that may not coincide with your previously held notions. The third agreement is to remember to speak your truth. All voices are important, and we want you to be open and authentic and to consider what others are saying while also embracing who you are and your experiences. And then the fourth agreement that we would like for you to consider is expect and accept non-closure. Hang out in uncertainty and don't rush to quick solutions. The issues that we will be discussing this evening are complex, and if they were easy, we would have solved them already. We thank you for your time and your engagement, and we look forward to this great conversation with these very important panelists. So, Dr. Santelisis, can you contextualize your work related to the diversification of the curriculum and the diversification of the education workforce?
Sure. No, I'd be happy to. Here in Baltimore City, with regards to the curriculum, the first thing that we really had to take a look at was how are our young people experiencing themselves within the context of where they live? And knowing that we live in a majority African-American city with a growing and significant immigrant community meant that we have had increasing numbers of Latino students and other international students over the past few years. And quite frankly, it was situated in a lot of what has become almost a negative narrative for Baltimore City. Our young people were seeing their city, their home represented in sometimes very disparaging ways, both within the local media as well as the national media. Some of it was what they were experiencing themselves, but very much compartmentalized, very much deficit focused. And so part of where we began with that was saying, how do we situate young people within the strengths of their community, within the history of wealth and generosity within their community. And quite frankly, for a number of our African-American students in particular, in traditions of Black excellence, right, that were just not being reflected in the current media. And so, yes, there are absolutely challenges, but we wanted our young people to be able to see themselves in what they were studying. And so actually, the lack of movement in our social studies curriculum gave us a wide open opportunity for our 6th through 12th graders to begin working with our social studies teachers, some of the best of our social studies teachers across the district, with support from the Gates Foundation, to build out what has now become what we call, what the young people named, our Be More Me curriculum. We started out with units such as, what does it mean to be a hero? Who deserves a statue, that really help them dive into their local history, but using a frame that reinforced the strength of their ethnic cultural identity as localized in Baltimore City, and then aligning that to the rigorous standards that we wanted them to have. We wanted it to still be very robust literacy experiences in reading and writing content, knowing all that we knew about that. So I would say we actually began that work prior to the pandemic, prior to the national uprisings, most recent uprisings. And some of that was, in some ways, the silver lining of already having experienced a lot of that latest bursting of racial dissatisfaction during kind of the city's response to the Freddie Gray death and trials after. And so that we really began that work prior to what the nation has now experienced over the course of the spring. And we're at the point now where we've begun rolling it out much beyond, I'd say, across our 6th through 12th grades. And it's also given our teachers and our teachers of color a voice in how we're developing that curriculum. So that was very important for us to situate our curriculum and our diversification in the reinforcement of the wealth and the historical richness of the tradition of a variety of communities in Baltimore City.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And the idea of the Be More Me initiative sounds perfect and probably speaks to parts of your life, Mr. Saldaña, as an alumnus of CIS and then to actually lead the organization. So can you tell us how is your work in the areas of diversifying the curriculum as well as the workforce considered ideas of systemic racism that are inherent in learning environments in the U.S.?
Thank you so much for the question, Tina, and also just to Walden for hosting this conversation. I'm honored to be on a panel with a distinguished panelist, and thank you to Dr. Santelises for really setting the stage, setting the table for this discussion, because I think it's one where we have to bring a lot of honesty, we have to bring a lot of history to the kinds of K through 12 evolutions, not always good in those evolutions and not always easy. But I will just say, as now the leader of a national nonprofit, and for folks who are not familiar with CIS, we focus on training a site coordinator to be in the schools, a site coordinator to create a relationship with young people. And across the country, 80% of the students we serve are Black or Brown. And I think for us now, as we've gone, especially looking back at the last 8 months through the pandemic, through the uprisings and the demonstrations through the summer, this question of what do we do about changing systems? I think systems have been a talking point for a lot of folks for a long time. And so at communities and schools, because we work in public schools, we have to identify our sphere of influence, like the sphere of influence that Dr. Santelises has at Baltimore Public Schools. At communities and schools, we have to even think about the entire system of public education. And I've said something that in other talks that I think has landed to be controversial in some places, but I don't know why, if it's so easy to look at our history, that public education was not built for Black or Brown students. They were not in mind when public education was first built in the foundation of our country. And it was times at which it was, our Black or Brown students or our Indigenous students or our Asian American students making their way into public education that accommodations had to be made. So we have to recognize, whether it's hard to hear or it's important to learn, that there is an inherent systemic racism within the institution of public education. And just to extend the metaphor even further, because I can point to so many instances throughout our history where we have struggled, whether it was desegregation and even the decades to 2 decades to truly get that right, to now what we're seeing more segregation in some of our schools than we ever have, even prior to 1954. It begs the question of, do we have the architecture of schools right? Is it truly meeting the needs of students, particularly students of color? And to that, I will just sort of point to a quick statistic. When you look at the snapshot of students sitting in public classrooms today, in 1980, the students who were living in poverty, that number was closer to 30% of students who were in public schools, who were suffering with some impact or barrier or obstacle that poverty can bring upon a student or a family. That number is now over 51%. Again, so 30% in 1980, 2016, the latest snapshot, it's 51% of the students in our public schools are suffering with some form of poverty and an impact that they bring into the school, that they bring into the curriculum, that they bring into the motivation for school and work, which is why curriculum makes so much sense for us to discuss, as how a student is showing up to school, how they're feeling like there is excellence in the history of their people and history of their built and their worth to this country. And so at CIS, the site coordinators that we work with, and really sometimes I bring my own experience into these conversations as well, is understanding that those systems don't always shift and evolve because of the natural process of time. And it takes a lot of folks really speaking up. And we're seeing that happen with our own alumni, with our own students. And that's hard to miss, and really a benefit to all of us if we're talking about this continually evolving system that is public education, that is shaking away from some of its roots.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your providing the historical context that we can't forget that the education system was not developed for Black children and Brown children and Indigenous children, and just start from now. These are the things that we have to consider. And so, Ms. Batchelor-Judge, Dr. Santelises and Mr. Saldaña are CEOs, and so they are controlling huge organizations and working with diverse groups. But you are our boots on the ground in front of teachers who are working with students and working with families. What has been the response of your organization in terms of the importance or necessity of diversifying the curriculum and the workforce, given the inequalities, some of which Mr. Saldaña spoke about, and then exacerbated by the pandemic and social unrest across the world? What has the response been for your organization?
Thank you so much, Dr. Bradley. And again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My organization's response to the diversifying of curriculum in the workforce has been a little bit slow, in my opinion. They have made some attempts to diversify and create schools or an infuse curriculum that appeal to different topics such as world languages and the STEM topic. But when we really get down to the root of just a basic American history, we still have some work to do. I think of just recently about an incident where a particular software company had a video about Black Lives Matter. And because some parents had some issues, because the teacher did infuse that, just that small little clip, now we have a new system for approving digital media to utilize in the classroom. And so, the organization is definitely slow to diversify. And then I also think about in terms of the makeup of the workforce. This is a district that is almost 50% minority, and that includes Black and Brown students. And so when you talk about what they see every day walking into the classroom, it's people that don't look like them. And so we expect for the people who don't look like them to identify for the students who they teach. And sometimes that is a struggle for them. And so, they have expectations, and usually those expectations are much lower than what would they expect of a child that looks like them. And so we're saying, even as an African-American woman, I am able to do the same expectations as my non-minority counterparts. And so hold me to that. But there's definitely different support that you want to be able to provide, knowing that the student will come with some different challenges or experiences that most would not have. And so those are just a couple of things. And, Ray definitely set it up in terms of just a number of issues that brings up. I even think about doing my research of Brown versus the Board of Education, and how actually that is part of the premise that is used for charter schools. And so, what happens? Those students leave the public K-12 system and take those same dollars and go to charter school. And then who's left in our public K system? Our Black and Brown students. And those dollars really matter to help ensure that they have the same access to curriculum, the same access to highly qualified educators who will provide them the rigorous instruction they need in order to be productive members of society.
Okay, great. And you bring up some excellent examples of not only the need for the diversification of the curriculum, but some of the challenges that may come about as individual teachers as well as systems attempt to do that. And so I would like for all of you to consider this information from this article I read. And Ms. Batchelor-Judge, I think it speaks to your scenario regarding the vetting of video. This summer, a Black teacher was put on leave based on a statement she made about police violence as a part of an English lesson. Her colleagues voiced their support for her in a letter to the district, citing that her statements were 100% true. Interestingly enough, they knew all of her statements were 100% true because her lesson had to be videoed because of the pandemic. So unlike maybe in a face-to-face classroom where a student may take a comment out of context and go, they were able to see exactly what she said and the way that she facilitated the lesson. So my question is, even if districts or organizations are successful in making the workforce as diverse as the student population, how do organizations support educators' work to meet the needs of all students?
So I think some of that, Tina, has to be at least, and again, admittedly, I'm speaking from the perspective now of a current large, urban school district. But I think part of what we have to do, one, is to give teachers the on-ramps in the main curriculum, right? If teachers are constantly having to go and pull stories from a variety of places because it's not in the main curriculum, they're more likely to get caught, for example, out on their own when they're trying to actually be representative in the example you're talking about. So I think having real discussions about where we are as a mainstay. And then the other piece I would say that I think we have to be very careful of, and some of the things that we have talked about in Baltimore City has been how do we also make sure that we're giving space for all viewpoints, because what begins to happen is when we have policing of voice, and I will give you a very real example, where there were comments posted on that folks did not like, that was really pushing on Black Lives Matter as a political organization, and immediately folks rushed in to censor and say that has to be taken off the website. And both myself and my equity executive director had to say, hold up, if you begin censoring that, then what begins to happen is then everything gets censored, right? And so you're actually limiting scope. And so for me, the question is, and we see it playing out in our nation right now, we can't even have dialogue across East-West, North-South, Black-White, Republican-Democrat. Everything has become so polarized. And I think, we've got to be the ones in K-12 to be able to say that you can't have partial censorship based on who's in control, right? It is about creating free space, and the same censure that somebody uses, that you use against somebody today, they're going to come back and use against you tomorrow.
Exactly.
And I would add to that too, in terms of, as an educator, part of our responsibilities is to prepare our students to think critically. And so when you censor voices and you censor the dialogues that students can really have, that puts a place where they can't think critically, because you're spoon feeding them what they're supposed to think versus allowing them the opportunity to come up with their own thought, their own reasoning, and being able to develop their own values. You hear sometimes with students and just even in the community, well, why are you affiliated with this political party? Well, my mom was, my granddaddy was, everybody, that's all I know, versus allowing them to really just take a look and really examine what's out there, hear multiple viewpoints, and allowing you to come to your own reasoning. And so, this is the opportunity now for us to really have those rich dialogue and discussion.
Just to follow up, I'm so grateful that I get to be in this conversation with folks who are seeing them, can point to some real examples of this. And I had an opportunity to listen to the article, listen to the story, which was really great. You think about the very specific nature of the case that was present in this article, which was that this teacher was describing a concept that many police are racist. And in that alone, I think, was what really sparked this question, this controversy. And I suppose that what somebody heard, because of this story as I followed it, was what I guess a parent heard this and then reported it to an authority figure within the school district. And the authority figure within the school district are trying to call balls and strikes. And I think Dr. Santelises described it. We try to, we don't want to play the role of referees as the heads of these organizations, but when you have to make a decision that tamps down speech, especially for our educators, you're putting yourselves in a position of having to define what harm is. Is a statement like many police are racist in the context of the discussion that she was having and how that might land on some students, was that a step too far? And I'm just grateful to the example that Dr. Santelises described, because even the concept of BLM and Black Lives Matter, it is the sound of it, the notion of it, the nuance of its meaning and its power is now more talked about in a way that people in the past, and I remember being on the city council in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was the first real beginnings of Black Lives Matter, the first time we heard that term, and you would say it and it would just turn people off completely. But now fast forward, and organizations, corporations, sports organizations have recognized that this is something that we can have a conversation about without rallying to our defensive positions. And so when this principal was presented with this concept of, did this cause harm to the student, grateful to know that when level heads prevailed on this one, this teacher was reinstated. But gosh, to think about being in Dr. Santelises' position and having to call balls and strikes on each one of these case by case, really, grateful to know that people who are in positions of authority, and this is how important representation is at all levels, to have people who understand the full context.
And thank you. All of your comments are so very important in terms of honoring the voices and the speeches. And, particularly, I like the fact that when teachers shouldn't have to be put in the position to make decisions, we need to examine our curriculum. But I do want to follow up in terms of when we're talking about diversifying the workforce and we're trying to recruit teachers of color or individuals of color to become teachers. When you see these kinds of things, how does that speak to you? I can't imagine what trauma this teacher, I'm saying this young teacher, she looked young to me, must have experienced as a part of that. How does that play into our work in diversifying the workforce?
Well, I would say that definitely there's more work to be done. We are now in a position where I feel like in the field of education and particularly K-12 education, we have to go through a rebranding because of just a number of things that have happened. People see the trauma that teachers experience and they're like, hey, I don't want to go into that profession. And so you may see in certain universities and colleges that the enrollment in the college education is down. And so it's like, how do we make people make education or the field of education and particularly educators more appealing? And we really have to really seek out and be strategic about who we try to recruit, and so it's one of those things of we can't just recruit Black and brown educators for the sake of we want them to be able to control our Black and brown students. We're just not there for disciplinary. We're there just as much as we love literacy, we love math, we love science, and so we want to share that love not only with all students, but in particular, our Black and brown students, to show them to say, hey, this is definitely a field that is exciting. And so I think it starts to come with the rebranding, but we definitely have to have a conversation about, what does recruiting looks like, how we're going about recruiting and being very strategic about that recruitment process.
Yeah, and Tanya, I would just second exactly what you were saying in terms of really acknowledging what the experiences on the ground of Black and brown educators are. I remember when I was at Ed Trust, Dr. Ashley Griffith, who was part of our research team, really launched into real on-the-ground research conversations with, she started with Black educators. She also followed up with a study of Latinx teachers. And what we found were patterns very similar to what Tanya just described, that over and over again, Black educators were being used as disciplinarians, which was a vestige of the same kind of things Rey was talking about in terms of, historical vestiges of the same kind of redlining. And what I call it is educational redlining. So what happens is if you're a Black educator, you're the one, what we were hearing from teachers, you're the one left in the building to make sure things don't blow up while your white colleagues get to go, right, to the teaching and learning professional development. And if teaching and learning, at least in Baltimore City, is the main factor that we take into account, you have in effect been sidelined from having access to those places of power. We heard from a number of our Latino teachers that they were being used as translators. And they were being used to translate things almost to fill in gap. Well, that was a job they weren't being paid to do. They were doing it out of a love for their community. But again, when Black and brown teachers are performing these supports and these actions, we know nationally they are often not the kinds of things that lead to promotions, that lead to being seen as leaders. And so these vestiges, we've really had to get under that in Baltimore City. And, I left Baltimore City to go with Ed Trust, and we had a majority of African-American teachers. I returned 3 years later to the district as CEO, and we had declined in numbers in a majority Black city we had declined almost 24% in just 3 years in the number of African-American teachers. So we asked African-American teachers, we asked them, what's keeping you from advancing? What's keeping you from staying? And then we asked a cohort of Black teachers to help us get better along these lines, really address some of these issues. Some are very technical. Some are about navigating certification. And if you don't have the knowledge of certification, everybody on this call who's gone through any kind of certification knows that if you don't know the ins and outs, that's enough to kill any love or interest you have in this field, right? And we hear it constantly. I just want to teach. But if you don't know that, so we have made real deliberate efforts. But I think, again, as Rey was saying, we've got to turn our mirror inward to see how are we replicating the same kind of hurdles for Black and brown teachers as we have put in place for Black and brown children. And I do have to say this, as controversial as this, I let everybody know, also, just because you are Black and brown, you still are required to be an excellent teacher. Like, that is not your pass. And I go in classrooms every day and I am really clear, like, thank you very much. I'm glad you look like your children and come from their community. But if you do not have solid teaching, solid command of your content, then you still shouldn't be in front of kids. And I think we also have to maintain that level of excellence and not make it an either or, which sometimes in conversation people try to say, well, it's either one or the other. No, we actually have a history of excellent Black and brown educators. Dr. Anderson's work speaks to that. Dr. Siddle Walker's research speaks to that. And we really have to make sure that we're not sacrificing one or the other, but we're saying we need a total package.
And if I can just jump in, especially on a concept Dr. Santelises described, and I get to lead a national organization that operates in 25 states. But just to speak to sort of national nonprofits that are working in education, there is some mirror holding that we have to do to ourselves as well. And I would say even our organization, I've been with the organization now for 6 months, but we've been around for 43 years. And other organizations who have the theory of change and the mission to work in underserved communities can often fall victim to this savior complex that exists. And it is not uncommon to see, even in communities in schools or the Teach for Americas of the world or City Year, that oftentimes what that looks like is a certain picture of a person who is coming into a community that's typically Black or brown. So there is even a reckoning that national nonprofits who want to do this work well, and we employ 3,500 site coordinators all across the country, taking a mirror to ourselves and saying, are we doing right? Because at the core of our work, our site coordinators in schools are developing one-on-one relationships with students. And when that one-on-one relationships requires that we have to invest in things like implicit bias training, does that mean that we're not necessarily hitting the mark when it comes to making sure that we are recruiting from the communities and advancing from the communities and retaining? So I wanted to make sure to bring that up as a national nonprofit who has to ask themselves these tough questions.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your everyone's, candor in terms of speaking about these issues, that the pipeline issue is not simply, a technical getting people in and teaching. And I truly appreciate Dr. Santelises' reference to models of excellence of African American teachers, the work of Vanessa Siddle Walker. And I just want to call out a book, Schools of Our Own, that was just published on the history of Black school excellence in the Chicago area. I want us to take just shift a little bit in terms of, as we're talking about diversifying the curriculum and as well as diversifying the workforce, the UCLA Office of Civil Rights reported data for the 2015-2016 academic year for students missing school because of discipline. White females lost 11 days of school per 100 students. For white males, it was 32 days lost. For Black females, it was over twice that of white males at 72 days. And for Black males, it was 132 days lost per 100 students. So my question is, does it matter what is taught and by whom it is taught if specific groups are not even present in the learning environment?
Yeah, maybe if I can jump in on this one, because it's an important policy that we've been tracking at CIS for a long time, which is not only the disproportionate impact of school discipline on Black and Brown students, but even now a topic that's getting more attention, which is the role of school resource officers or police in schools. And what we've kind of had to really navigate, which is it's tough waters, and I'm sure that Dr. Santelises can help guide and probably give more advice on this than I can. But as a national nonprofit who is invited to work in schools, and in our case at CIS, we're working with students who are oftentimes dealing with circumstances that they are bringing from outside of the school, in the community, in their home, whether those are chaotic environments where they're raising their siblings, environments where, you know, I was in a virtual call in West Virginia where they're dealing with the opioid epidemic. There is this very, quick thing that we have in some of our schools where oftentimes there is, like we've had these discussions around police, there's only one tool in the toolbox, which is 911, or in the case of school districts, like let's get our SROs involved, or what's the policy on this for students and how that has been layered on. And so sometimes when I say a national nonprofit or an organization working in schools, we know that we have to navigate these systems for the students because we advocate on their behalf, but we're also wondering what authority or agency we might have to question the discipline policy. And sometimes I would say in the past, we have hesitated from speaking up and bringing it to the leadership. Now I think in our work, because it's so integrated with schools that we work with, that we're sitting side by side with principals and teachers talking about what the case has been for a caseload of 20 or 30 students, and how many of them have been referred to us not because of academics or because of attendance, but specifically because of behavior. And when I think about the architecture of schools, to go back to the original question that we had, is are schools built for us? And I think right now, there's not always a stopgap. There's not always a psych coordinator or a social worker or a mental health counselor in some of these schools, so that there is only one journey that oftentimes, we've talked a lot, and there's a ton of research about the school to prison pipeline. How are we building schools to avoid that kind of quick pivot to immediately, raising the stakes in the situation by involving discipline or an SRO? So really complicated issues. And sometimes when we think about policies, it's how do we do this in a standardized way, even though our children and their circumstances are not always standardized.
Absolutely.
No, I would just affirm that the issues are complex, and there's not one easy way. I mean, as Rey was speaking, I just thought of so many different themes in what he was saying. There's the theme of like behavior and the criminalization of Black and Brown children, and the adultification of Black and Brown children, and how that leads to exceptions. Monique Morris's work, which so many of us have been reading about the criminalization of Black girls in addition to Black boys, and what that actually looks like. And then there is this question of school police. And I think it's a robust one. And it's a conversation that's needed to be had for quite some time. I will say, living in a city, very forthrightly, with the murder rate that we have, if we were to remove every police officer from every school tomorrow, we would have pushback from students. A number of our school police officers are actually why our young people can stay late for track practice, for young entrepreneurs, because they have a school police officer who will stand at the corner and make sure they can actually go to the bus safely. But on the other side of things, I don't want to gloss over the fact that we have had to do major reworking over the last 4 to 6 years. And I'm just incredibly blessed, and I will name it, that Chief Akil Ham is one of the best in the country. He has, we had an incident about 5 years ago where we had a school police officer, and I don't know any other way to say it in my old school self, of jacking up a kid against a locker. And Chief Ham and I sat down and had a conversation. And I said, if this happens again, everybody's out. So we got to figure out how we're going to do this. And systematically over the last 4 to 5 years, it has been under Chief Ham's leadership that, frankly, something as simple as moving out of the front line officers that aren't good with kids, that they shouldn't be in front of children, right? So, I mean, that in and of itself is the first step. The other piece is our school police officers became some of the best in the state on de-escalation, on implicit bias training. They went through child development courses, right? What should we expect from a middle school, an 11-year-old? I don't care what they're physically presenting as, right? This is where their brains are. And so what we've seen, if I'm going to be really forthright, is that actually our school police officers that are still in schools actually do better de-escalation, and it might be controversial to say it, than some of our teachers. They know how to de-escalate better because, again, under Akil Ham's leadership, he has not been afraid. He's listened to students. If there's an officer with more than 2 to 3 complaints about how they're handling young people, he moves them immediately. Right? He doesn't wait and say, let's do a 6-month investigation. He moves them immediately away from children, does the investigation while they're away from children, and then makes that. So I didn't mean to go on, but I just want to say these issues are complex, and that I think part of what we have suffered from in this country, and frankly in education, is we do these knee-jerk reactions. We take the flavor of the month and we say, oh, now this is going to solve things, without really digging deeply into what are the experiences on the ground. So sorry to go on and on about that.
No. I was going to say, I hear the complexity of all of these issues. And of course, we know that they are, but you all, both you and Mr. Saldaña, Dr. Santelisis, actually provided some examples of where these very difficult and very complex situations were, but you actually were able to address them by working not just with the education community, but in other areas also. I want us to go back to looking at the diversification of the workforce, and I want to cite a 2017 study published by Johns Hopkins University that presented findings that Black students who had at least one Black teacher in kindergarten through 3rd grade, those students were 15% less likely to drop out of school and 10% more likely to take a college entrance exam. So especially Ms. Batchelor-Judge, like I said, you're on the ground, you're a principal. Are there ways to use information like this from these studies to address the issue of representation in the teaching workforce, to attract teachers of color to the teaching workforce?
Yes, I definitely believe so. And in addition to that, I want to go back to previously what we were talking about, and just really shift to from a parent perspective, a parent of a American male, where I definitely have experience or had my share of experiences with my son and his troubles while going through the K-12 system, and how immediately some teachers wanted to label him and really felt like just because he was part of a single parent home that he didn't have the necessary support. And so again, some of those biases and preconceived notions, but really coming to the table and understand that this is a partnership, and that's the key that I stand wholly, that this is a partnership. This is all stakeholders have to be at the table and willing to hold up their end, because at the end of the day, who suffers or who's successful is going to be the student. And so it has to be a partnership. And I think about even when you talk about the role of Black and brown educators throughout the your education system, and just reflected on how many my son has had. He's had one between K through 3. He had one during his middle school years, and is actually the one in middle school years that really almost would have turned his experience about whether or not to continue on to high school. And it was African-American male. And so it was one of those things that I literally had to go to the school and with the principal and him and say, look, you cannot treat him this way. Whatever your preconceived notions about him are, my child still has access or still desires access to the same education, the same rigorous instruction that is needed to be successful. And so that is so critical that, Dr. Santelisis said earlier, even Black and brown educators, you're still hold to the same standard of excellence in providing instruction, because no matter what, you can either help a child be successful or derail a child from education totally. And so that's where we see children experience certain trauma, and they're like, I'm totally turned off from education. I don't want to do math anymore, or I have a fright of reading. I don't want to read because of what they experience in the classroom, no matter what that educator looks like. But it's also, I think about the one educator at Howard W. Blake, Miss Gwen Williams, who it was her that helped support my son. He became the top completer in the magnet program, which was the Urban Teaching Academy, and his desire to continue on in education. And I just say, hey, why don't you look at the program? My son is very great with children and seasoned individuals. And I was just like, just look at it. But it was her that helped cultivate that continuous desire to be an educator. And so those statistics are definitely important in helping to create the branding that I talked about earlier. And for recruitment, think about how many educators, Black or brown educators that you had through years, is probably that one that made an impact and make you want to go into education, or at least, and even if you don't stay, 10, 20, 50, 10, 20, 30 years, even if you just stay 10 years and see where your students go. There's some students I've had in sixth grade who are now productive members of society, and I see them out in the stores and married and children. It's so exciting to see that. And so just to know I had that impact, it makes you feel like it's definitely worth it.
Great. Very important points. Just wanted to make sure, Mr. Saldaña or Dr. Santelises, and you all touched on this a moment ago regarding the importance of, especially with the curriculum Be More Me that was talked about earlier, that of course Black and brown teachers have to be good teachers, but that representation is actually extremely important. Any final words around perhaps challenges that you see in terms of starting that pipeline with individuals going into education?
Well, I think one of the things that we just need to talk really forthrightly about is that one, teaching has fallen out of favor in many communities of color. And we just need to name that, right? Parents, families pour into, and I thought it was just me because I'm old. I'm like, well, I'm 52. Maybe it's changed since then. It hasn't changed since then. My mother almost passed out when I told her I wanted to go into teaching. She was like, are you kidding me? All that we put into you and you want to go teach? And that is still the case, by the way. She has since forgiven me and is very, very proud. But, it was a struggle. It was a struggle. And when we have, folks who are the first in their family to go to college, and some of our teacher salaries, fortunately in Baltimore cities, our teacher salaries are fairly, fairly attractive. But, I look at colleagues in places like Oklahoma and Tulsa that has absolutely poverty rate salaries. My good friend and colleague, Deborah, just has been there and she's been trying to move that. But to tell somebody you're the first in your family, we want you to go into an occupation that feels like it's under-resourced, under attack, particularly if you're trying to go back to your community, right? If you're going back to your community, you're going back to a redlined, under-resourced community as the first in your family, that's a tough sell. And I think we've got to be honest about that. We have to provide incentives. We have to make it easier for people to apprentice. We have paraprofessional to teacher programs that we have revitalized. At first we'd have 3 or 4 folks come in, but then we realized, our paraprofessionals most often were people from the neighborhoods, from the communities, who had interrupted higher education, right, opportunity because they might have had financial obligations. I mean, even, I remember being at Ed Trust and even, young people of color who wanted to do education policy work. They couldn't afford to come to DC, rent an apartment, and then say, oh, we want you to work for pittance because this is going to look good on your resume. I just think we have to have real hardcore conversations about differentiated incentives if we really and truly want our young people to have teachers from the communities that they serve. But yeah, my mom took a lot of grief for a lot of years. They were like, Verna, we can't believe you and Jack paid all that money for that child's education, for her to go teach in Brooklyn. They just thought my parents were nuts. So we've got to do some work on our end too.
Thank you, Dr. Santelises, for naming that. I just have to say, it's so funny sometimes, growing up in a low-income community and a family doesn't make much. And I had the chance to go off to a good school, West Coast, at Stanford. And when I told my folks I was going to be going into public service, and they said, you've got more degrees in the month of July, and you're going to come back and run for office and make nothing. Like it is, I think, an interesting paradox that we have with a lot of community members that we work with who are from some of the communities that we want to really lift up. And then we think about them doing well, and the incentive to come back is, okay, do so and scrounge around if you can to do the unpaid internship. I talk to so many alumni who've gone through our program who want to go off and do things that I see their counterparts who are wealthier able to do and able to get connected because an uncle or a cousin is at the New York Times and will provide them with an internship level to help them elevate. It is, I think, just a one piece. You mentioned at the beginning that there was this, we can't solve the whole problem. So I'm just going to sort of say that the description of what I think is an interesting problem that we have. But here in San Antonio, here in Texas, in my previous work with Raise Your Hand Texas, which was an education advocacy organization, we talked about teacher quality and how sometimes the unicorns were these teachers who were male and men of color. And were just getting recruited by the private schools and recruited by the school districts who could pay them more. And so what happened again is the schools that really needed the high quality teachers or the students who wanted teachers who were reflective of them oftentimes ended up going to places naturally that would sort of make sense from an incentive standpoint for them. And so because that is still the case, that these folks are unicorns, there's not enough to go around. They do get recruited and they end up in places that are not necessarily serving the students of the highest need.
Such great insights. And colleagues, our viewers and participants are chomping at the bit to ask you their questions. So it's my great pleasure to transition and to present my colleague again, Mr. Ulysses Wilcox, who will present some of the questions from individuals who are out there and who have been fortunate enough to receive the information. Mr. Wilcox?
Hi, thank you, Tina, and thank you to the esteemed panelists. This has been some great conversation and some eye-openers for us all. So now it's time, and again, for the audience, you can still submit your questions in the Q&A box window. And there are some articles listed in the resource list at the bottom as well. So to my esteemed panelists, our first question of the evening is from Cleopatra. And she states, how will states and school districts plan to close the expanded achievement gap caused by COVID-19? The achievement gap that exists between students of color and white students has been well documented. Do you know how COVID-19 is impacting the existing achievement gap, and how might states and school districts better understand what's happening?
I would definitely say that the state is definitely aware of the achievement gap that is happening. And I believe that's why there's such a push now for, I can definitely say in the state of Florida, for students to return full-time on campus. Because at the end of the day, we also want to be able to measure the students' progress. And so I believe states are aware. Now, what are we going to do to close that achievement gap that has now increased because of that pandemic? It's going to definitely take more boots on the ground, as we like to say, more work, but it's definitely going to ensure that we need to have some real true and honest conversations about what does the curriculum look like, and more so, how do we get our students to become proficient in the standards? If anybody has been following the state of Florida have just implemented or just voted to change or transition to the best standards, away from the Florida standards, which is kind of a copy of the Common Core standards. So we have a number of things going on right now. And so it's really going to take some honest conversation of all stakeholders at the table and really to see what is going to be our plan as we address the gaps in curriculum.
No, and I would just build on what I think what I think Dr. Batchelor-Judge just said. Sorry, and by the way, I call people by their first names if I feel comfortable with them, so I'm not being disrespectful. When I say Rey and Tanya and Tina, it's because I feel comfortable with you. So I need to say that for all my aunties who would be like, girl, why are you not calling people by their titles? So I just want to put that out there. But yes, it is. It's a major question. I just actually was part of a group of superintendents here in Maryland earlier today, where we were asked this very question. And so I would just offer a couple of things. One, we have to acknowledge that we had children that were behind even before this pandemic, right? And so this has been the opportunity to begin to either accelerate and explore new ways of really moving young people fast. I have really unequivocally said this cannot be about remediation. There is no evidence that remediation works. And so we've started, for example, investing in things like tutoring. Why? Because as a professional mom, my husband and I, if our daughters have a challenge with a subject area, we do not hold them back a grade level. We go out and we get them more targeted, individualized instruction. And so we've been mobilizing a lot of our community organizations to really come around our young people with more and a better tutoring. I think the other piece is a silver lining in needing to scale up our technology as fast as we had to back in March. And we went from, I've said this numerous times, we went from a district that had a ratio of 1 device for every 4 students to overnight having to lift up, via our teachers who did a great job, 10,000 Google Classrooms within a week span. So now that we've had this press for broadband and press to get devices in the hands of kids, a couple of what I've heard from some teachers is, well, you know what, Dr. S, we had all these supplemental kinds of experiences and exercise through technology that were always there, but the kids didn't have the access to the technology to do it on a regular, widespread basis. And so some of them are actually really excited because they're like, all of my kids now have a device. And so I can send a note home and say, look, based on the skills assessment of where your child is, and the computer, the technology is such now that we even have devices that can give, artificial intelligence support to first graders on how to pronounce and blend sounds, right? So part of what I think we've been really trying to do in this is say, what are the opportunities that are presenting themselves in this time of crisis that we might not have been able to do before. And then just one more thing that I'd like to say, because it relates to the chronic absent question that Tina asked earlier, but I think relates to this as well, is that some of our high school students are telling us, actually, we do much better logging in, completing the work. So I actually don't have to sit there while somebody watches the timer to see if I'm there. I can go and have my job, come back home, view the recorded lesson and do far better than I would if all you guys are doing is checking boxes for my seat time. So I think we need to have some real hard discussions about the shift from the agrarian charting of time. And look, I sit on the board at the, for the Carnegie, Foundation Advancement of Teaching. So I know the history behind the Carnegie unit as marker of time. But I will say, even as a board member, we got to move beyond that. Like, it is not about punching in a time clock to see whether a student's there. And frankly, in some of our alternative schools, some of my principals on the side are saying, Dr. S, I got to tell you, some of these kids that had checked out are actually now turning in more work than they did before the pandemic. So, we've got to really use this time to really self-examine some of the things that we took for granted in education that just weren't working.
Interject real quickly. I would say, as a professional development specialist, one of the things I tried to infuse this year was help our teachers do that same concept, flip the classroom, utilize the classroom as a way of providing that support, but do the lessons and instructions digitally. And that has been one of the major challenges in my role, is getting some teachers to shift their mindset that you don't have to utilize the classroom and provide that traditional seat time instruction. This is a great opportunity to flip it, because if research has shown that if students have ownership of their learning, they're going to be far more engaged and do far better than you just spoon feeding or feeding them that information. And so I would say that is definitely just not only a shift from, leadership spec, but also those who are in the classroom, like, hey, there's a shift in the mindset. This is an opportunity for us to flip how we view instruction.
I have to say, I love when I get to sit on a panel and just learn while I'm sitting on a panel as well. And the description of the silver lining, and just to take the question and describe it in another way, I think state leaders, policymakers are getting a lot smarter about not just the academic achievement gap, it's the opportunity gap. And I know it's semantics, but just to speak to what one of the examples was, now all of a sudden we're getting more tech and devices in the hands of students. And if you look at Raj Chetty's work in Opportunity Index in places like Charlotte, he will point out that this was 3 years ago when he's looking at the work, the huge digital divide gap. Like, I wonder what that snapshot looks like now, that all across the country. And I say this because I get the chance to not only sit with some state chiefs of education, but also read their reports on what we need to do to reopen, to go to a better normal, as now they're discussing. And it is this huge investment in the infrastructure of closing the digital divide gap. If we get there, we don't know, but boy, are we going to have a huge shot at doing it, in the same way that the Great Depression gave us Social Security. There is a way to go back to a different normal. And one thing that I've learned, that the state chief in California, in Texas, in Nevada, and even in Maryland, when I read the report, it was that they also don't want to forget about the social, emotional, and non-academic and wraparound services that some of our students are going to need, because of how difficult it was to reach students who are having food insecurity issues, access to a safe space, because that was school for them. And how important it was, especially for an organization like ours, who works and focuses on those pieces, to get that to students in a virtual environment, to get an honest assessment of whether they feel safe if they're in a screen. So folks looking at wraparound services and social emotional is also a new way to get better at the opportunity gap.
Great. So we have time for a couple more questions. And I have a question from Bill here. And he states, are there any private organizations that are focused on developing and supporting a more diverse K-12 workforce? And how is school choice in urban areas affecting the supply of minority teachers?
So I actually think that there are far more organizations today that are focused on the diversification of the teaching workforce. I think, as Ray referenced earlier, you have progress in organizations like Teach for America and TNTP actually looking more internal. New Leaders for New Schools has done work on how do we adjust how we've been looking at the issue. And then I think you have new organizations that are rising. Sal Malecki out of Philly has an organization that is very much focused on Black male educators training, developing, mentoring upcoming Black male educators. And so I think what's really exciting is you're beginning to see communities of color, frankly, raising their own teachers. And I think it's an empowering stance. And, one of the things I've always said, my dad, I used to battle with him a lot on this, but he will tell you, and I'm not saying we need to go back to Jim Crow days, so hear me. But, his thing was, he's like, Sonja, you all have more issues with student expectations than I found when I was going to school in 1940s, 1950s, Jackson, Mississippi. He said, because we had teachers there who insulated us, who we saw as leaders, who were part of our community, who believed in our greatness, and it was our protective coating against a real violent hegemonic attack against young Black minds. And you all did not, and he says you all whenever he wants to comment on present day educators, he said, and you all didn't factor that. You have not factored in that protective coating that it takes to raise like whole children of color in this. And I think about, some of our, families that are dealing with like ICE raids, right? And so you talk about social emotional, you've got to be able to come around and understand that and develop it. And I actually think I've been very heartened by the focus on the diversification of the workforce that I haven't seen in years. I haven't seen in years. And I think there are so many new organizations and support groups now than when I started teaching like 30 years ago.
I definitely totally agree with that. It's one of those things as an educator, and doing some research, I wondered, wondered the same thing. What happened to our Black educators? When we decided to desegregate the school, where did they go? What did it took to even, teach, in those times? And about, are we embodying those? And I think that's the missing piece, is that present educators, Black and brown educators, are trying to embody that, but we don't really truly understand full context. And the goal is to, provide all of that. And some of us don't have the capacity at the moment, but we definitely desire to do that.
Great. Ray, do you want to jump in, or?
No, I think that they've said all that needs to be said. I think we've got it.
All right, great. So this is going to be the last question of the evening before I turn it back over to Tina. And the question is, have you all had an opportunity to look at Toronto or Ontario's education system? And this question is coming from Laurie. Have you looked outside of the U.S. school system at any other school systems that would have some guidance here?
I mean, I've looked outside of the United States, but I can't say I've looked to Toronto or Ontario recently, just to be, forthright about it. I haven't looked there. I do think there's some really interesting work that's going on in countries that we don't often think of as being, bastions of educational excellence, but quite frankly, are doing more to move young people out of poverty faster than we are in the United States, with far fewer resources. I think what's going to be sad is that this worldwide pandemic is knocking a lot of that progress back, unfortunately, decades. But I think some of the work that's been going around that's more akin to what I'm dealing with in Baltimore is actually taking place in places like India, in places like South Africa, in places like Brazil. I think that there are pockets that frankly relate more to me. And I have great friends and colleagues in Canada. I mean, I don't, I'm not adverse to visiting there, but I think when I look at and I look for examples to relate internationally to my school leaders here, actually, some of those countries are the ones where you kind of silence folks who want to keep going on and on about how, well, we don't have this doc and, we don't have that doc. And I was like, really? Have you been to school in India lately? Have you been to, right, like former townships and seen what they're doing with technology and cell phones? And then, people are like, oh, okay, guess we've got to get back to work. So I haven't, but thank you for the suggestion and more than happy to look into it.
Great. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Tina.
Ulysses, thank you so much for that. And I know that there are so many more questions and conversations that are going on. And this is the purpose for Talks for Good. We are honored to have such an esteemed panel. But of course, we want people to continue the dialogue with each other. And so now, as we're looking at closing out the session, almost to my chagrin, because Ray, I agree with you 100%. This was school. We almost went to church, but it definitely was school. But I want to capture for each one of you, or I want you to capture for us. You've already given us such hope and so many great resources. But I want you to consider, across your careers, and you've done some of this. What are some insights that you can share with the community on things that you think that we need to do to ensure that we are not just diversifying the curriculum for its own sake, but getting at truth and actually inviting other voices and individuals and diversifying the workforce? What is it that you see is most important?
Yeah, maybe if I can kick off here, specifically because I think it's just what a joy to be alive right now. And I sometimes think about our time in history and how some folks can either assume that this is an unfortunate time to be around, or this is the best time to be around. Because as a student of history, I used to look at the late 60s and wonder what it was like to get to grow up and to be in this spirit of activism and change and movement, but also tumultuous times. And if you think of a year like 1968, but it's Bobby Kennedy who said, "May you live in interesting times." And I think we live in interesting times. And what I think is also important is that they're also some of the most exciting times for change. And whether it's on the issues that we just discussed around the silver linings, what is the good that we might make of the condition that we're in or the circumstance, I also just think of like the evolution of our ability to have and broker these honest conversations that even if you think about a place like Texas where I am, where it was incredibly controversial to talk about Mexican-American studies, and it would go before the State Board of Education and they would shut it down year after year after year. That goes through, and I'm tracking sort of where that is now, and there is a sort of new welcomeness to the change, the understanding not just change for change's sake, but its benefit to the educational system, the students, their engagement, they're seeing themselves in the work and in the history and in the science. And I think it coalesces with this connection between what we've seen in terms of progress that we're trying to make within public schools. And as somebody who leads an organization who truly cares about this piece around what are those non-academic things that are keeping students from performing in school, because whether it is the circumstances of a student's life that are out of their control, or just kids being kids that sometimes need some extra support or counseling, there is such a thin margin of error for some of our students, especially not just those who are Black and brown, but students who live in poverty, that you don't get a lot of chances to make mistakes. And I think a school system that is built to understand that formula exists for a lot of our students is really, taking advantage of this moment and taking advantage to building to better. And so I think that's why it's just such an exciting time to be around, and what a pleasure to get to be part of these conversations.
I would definitely say that, thank you, Ray, for that, because it leads to three things I will want to leave. Time, definitely it's our time now to have some honest and true conversation about the system that we call public education. It is also time for us to ensure that all stakeholders are at the table and we can have this conversation in order to address the talents and sometimes the lack of talents that exist. And then lastly, but most importantly, is the treasure. We do have to put money back into our public education system. We have to be physically responsible of that money. And most of that money can't go into testing. It does have to go into building our talents. And so those are the three things: our time, our talents, and our treasures. We definitely have to have some conversation around.
And Ray and Tanya just touched on so many important things. So I think what I would just add in a very similar vein, though, is let's not miss this opportunity. Thomas Friedman, I got a chance to, be on a panel with him last week, and, the author of, The World is Flat and Thank You for Being Late. And one of the things that I think is so important is with the storm and the tumult of just the immediate for so many of the families we serve, as Ray noted, like there's so many factors outside of school that really impact our young people. I would say let's not lose sight of the shift that is currently occurring in this field and in our communities. I, back in March, thought, nothing will really change because we'll be back in school in 2 months, right, by the end of the summer. And that is clearly not happening. We are prepping for the next 18 to 24 months to be some variation of what we're experiencing now. And I just want to urge everyone, the same way I'm urging myself and my team, to really acknowledge that there is an open window in education unlike at any point in our lifetime. And families are seeing the differences sitting in their kitchen, sitting in their bedrooms. They have a vision into the work we do. And at our peril, we continue to think that they have no choice but to stay with us. They were going to have so many other choices after this pandemic and during it. We have families who, if we are honest, we're not going to see again if we don't change how we do school. And it is hard turning a behemoth, in my case, that serves 79,000 young people, 10,000 employees. But what I have said to folks is you can look to your left, kind of like old Morehouse, look to your left, look to your right. If we don't change, half of y'all are going to be gone, because we have now communities that are not going to stand for the return back to what they had, both in terms of how we cared for our Black, brown, low income students. And Ray is right. We have low income students from all communities who are vulnerable. So I would just urge us, and I keep trying to say this like regularly for my team, it is to our peril if we continue to think that we have customers, we have students and families who are just going to stay with us for the sake of staying with us. This whole paradigm shift, you watch, there's going to be more virtual schooling options now than there ever were before. And there are families who are going to say, at least I don't have, a school resource officer or a culturally insensitive teacher trying to down my kids every day. We have got to be prepared to say, we hear you, we're going to really work to do business differently. And if we don't, and what Thomas Friedman talks about, this thing is moving so fast that the future belongs to the people who learn rapidly and are flexible. And we stay petrified at our peril. If we don't shift, people are going to move on.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. As I said, not only panelists did you all provide wonderful and insightful information, you also gave us hope and a look into the future and a way into the future. Some of the takeaways that I'm going to leave and continue to work on. Many of you have, several of you have mentioned researchers and books that I plan to put on my ever-growing resource list. Sonja, thank you for your nod to those countries who are doing some very amazing things with populations similar to the communities that we serve. Rey, the talk about the welcoming of a look into studies that look at Latinx communities and other communities that used to be taboo, whereas now we're embracing this because if we all rise or fall together, so we see that change. And Tanya, your passion because of your son, as well as the other students that you serve in your school, is extremely inspiring. And we see the positive impact on social change that you have taken from Walden University and have brought to life. And so we thank you very much for the work that you've done. And for those of you who have joined us this evening, I know that you're full and inspired and ready to go out and do the good work. And so we thank you for being here. Please know that the panelists have been so gracious as to share their contact information with us. And so if you would like to reach out to them, their information is available. You will also be receiving a survey via email. It's coming to the same email where you registered. We would love to hear from you. We want to hear your feedback. We understand that this is an extremely important topic, and we want to make sure that the dialogue continues. And with that, we once again thank everybody for all that you do for in the lives of children. And we look forward to seeing you at our next Talks for Good. Thank you, everyone, and good night.